Let's Talk Global Business, the show in which we look at the economic and business trends connecting the world. I'm Sarah Murray, Managing Director International at the Conference Board, the member-led global think tank that delivers trusted insights for what's ahead. In this episode, we're talking about pay transparency, what it really looks like inside organisations and how it's reshaping conversations about fairness, equity and trust at work. With the EU's new directive coming into force in 2026, companies across Europe are getting ready to implement the new rules while figuring out what compliance will do to their ability to hire and retain employees. To help me pack things, I've invited three special guests to join me today. Saul Husiman, Head of Reward International Advisory at Swiss Re, John Beadle, Council Director for the Corporate Reward Council at the Conference Board and former Global Head of Performance and Reward at ABB, and Marion Devine, Principal Researcher at the Human Capital Centre in Europe. So to kick things off, I'm going to ask you all a simple question. Is the Pay Transparency Directive causing HR havoc? Saul, would you like to go first?
Yes, indeed. So absolutely. So the EU Pay Transparency Directive really represents a paradigm shift in how organizations, particularly in HR departments, will really have to manage and support everything from a compensation to an equity to a compliance and also importantly from a communication aspect as well. So this is really what we call the directive with teeth, so to say. So this isn't just a legal obligation or compliance initiative. This is really a catalyst for transformational change. And we'll see that across strategies and technologies, but also important in the governance area as well.
Yeah, look, I think chaos and confusion is best terminology for it, because I think to some degree it is causing both. Some of it's a responsibility of the European regulators themselves, and some, frankly, our own organisations. And a couple of examples on the regulator side. No clarity still on the legislation for the majority of EU countries with less than a year to go. So very little time to prepare. The impracticality of some of the approaches, for example, the way that benefits are going to be valued, I think is causing a real headache for organisations. But organisations themselves have to take some degree of responsibility. The state of our data landscape was never good, and this has really, I think, shown just how challenging it is for many of us. And frankly, not having adequately dealt with the issue in the first place has actually led, I think, to this regulation. So to a degree, we're kind of victims of our own problems.
So it's hard to add to that. I think from our perspective of running a survey and doing interviews with our member companies, I think what John said is yes, there is certainly a lot of anxiety and a lot of, I think, frustration as well. Frustration with the burden of the bureaucracy, the workload, the ambiguity that is still very much existing in terms of how on earth do we make this work at the country level. But I also sense a sense, of almost begrudging, actually, the feeling of this could be a landmark. This could be a real sort of watershed in how in companies' own internal pay systems, the robustness of them, the robustness of the data, if they can just get through. And on the other side, I think that there will be a sense they will be in so much better shape with all their pay systems and policies. So painful, but it has the potential to bring some high rewards.
Thank you. So we're getting started. Let's just talk about the first steps towards pay transparency and the big picture. Marion, can you explain for the listeners what pay transparency is? And can you just give us a brief history of the idea? Where did it come from? How has it evolved over time?
I certainly will, Sarah. It could be a challenge, but I'm determined to be pithy here. I think the first thing I really want to emphasize is that when we talk about pay transparency around the world, it does have different meanings, and there are differing variations of transparency, if that is possible. So in some areas of the country, it's really just transparency for job candidates. The EU is attempting to establish a really high gold standard in terms of rights and requirements. So just to say what the directive is, I think it's sweeping in scope because pay is defined as wide as possible. It is base salary, and other pay elements like bonus, overtime, allowances, sick pay. So it is everything, basically. The disclosure is, again, the ceiling is tough. Employers with at least 100 plus employees must disclose their gender pay gap data, and that will be very hard for smaller companies. And I think particularly the shift in the burden of proof in terms of claims will shift to the employer to really have to prove that there isn't some sort of inequality going on. So it sets a gold standard in rights and responsibilities. So employees can no longer stop employees from disclosing their pay details. They can't have pay secrecy clauses anymore. They must be really, really sort of rigorous in terms of their pay criteria. It's got to be gender neutral. So this means that they really have to show that their job evaluation and their classification systems are really fair. Applicants will have the right to receive information on the initial pay level for any advertised position. So companies are a little bit concerned about, having to divulge quite competitive and sensitive information. Employees must share information on the criteria for how pay is set, and this also includes promotion and career progression and the decisions around that. And employees can ask their employer for information about their pay levels, average pay levels, and also they have the right to ask about other workers doing the same work or work of equal value. So companies also cannot ask pre-job applicants about their pay. So it's really quite sweeping in lots of ways, and it gives new rights to employees and job candidates and really shifts the onus onto companies.
Thank you, Marion. John, you've been in charge of setting pay and compensation globally at ABB. What was your first reaction to the news that the EU was introducing a pay transparency rule?
Yes, so look, I think conceptually I was quite pleased, because it's really building on the practice of a number of countries around the world, everywhere from Australia to India, as well as the major European countries, have adopted an approach here. And also in the US, where we know that many states have adopted a version of pay transparency. And I think many organizations needed that push into the area. We've seen it first in executive pay. And now, again, I think this approach with the broader population is potentially a positive sign. I have to say, though, I'm very disappointed about the detail. There's not been enough time to execute. I think the approach has been overly bureaucratic and far too comprehensive. We could have started with the main comp elements, and then broadened out over time. And that combination, I think, means that most organizations are now having to rush to make this a tick box compliance exercise, rather frankly like the sustainability regulations that have just come through, rather than a fundamental culture change, which is what it could have been.
Yeah, it has the opportunity to do that, but indeed, if it's too much bureaucracy, it defeats the purpose, really. Saul, does John's experience chime with your own at Swiss Re? How did you first approach the issue?
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree with John. And I think for Swiss Re, we were a little bit ahead of the curve in terms of our preparation. So for us, this wasn't just a compliance issue. This was, again, really a fundamental shift of how we engage our leaders at Swiss Re on pay, but also importantly around career progression. How do we manage the risks that are associated with them? And importantly, how do we compete for talent in the marketplace? So the EU directive really meant that the bar was being raised just from our internal equity to really the external visibility and accountability there. This was a big leap, but as I mentioned, this was something that Swiss Re had already started back in 2017. So we already had a lot of the building blocks in place for pay transparency. We had been running annual pay audits. We had reviewed and adapted a lot of our internal policies and processes to address pay inequities and generally to prepare for pay disclosure. So as of 2021, we started to disclose a lot of our pay gaps, so the raw and adjusted in our annual report, in our sustainability report, but also importantly to our employees on an annual basis as well. So these were really sort of fundamental to ensure that from an organizational readiness perspective, Swiss Re was really in a prime position to be one of the first movers sort of in the financial services industry and to be, one of the market leaders in across all industries when looking at global pay transparency.
Thank you. If we move now to the human side, managers, culture, and communication, Marion, your research suggests that line managers still aren't fully prepared. Give us your assessment of business readiness across Europe and globally.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. We did a survey last year with our EMEA and global heads of reward, and we did it again this year. And I think that, as you said, Sarah, in 2024, almost a year ago, 40% hadn't started their preparations. That has changed, and it's now only sort of 17% that haven't started. So the majority are preparing, but it's still, companies have been very slow off the mark. And as John says, maybe there is an almighty scramble going on. We asked them about their confidence to meet the requirements of the directive, and actually, only 5% are actually confident. The rest are sort of in the middle somewhere, but only 5% say, yep, we're ready. And the focus of activity is still very much on internal sort of housekeeping, as major as they are, internal pay audits, revising job architectures, looking at pay and career progression criteria, as this has to be gender neutral and squeaky clean. And interestingly, nearly 70% are actually at the moment taking action to address pay inequalities. So they really are getting their house in order. The biggest shift we've seen in terms of readiness is that companies are scaling back their ambition for a global pay transparency policy. I think they're just realizing that it's harder than they thought. Whereas a year ago, 45% were saying, yep, we're going to go global. That's shrunk to 22%. So that's quite a big shift. And I think it just reflects the fact that actually it's proven to be much harder and there's so much uncertainty around them. So most important, really, companies are in the weeds and they're not looking at the wider implications of how pay transparency will affect talent and culture. Only 15% think that their culture is ready to support transparency. And as you said, Sarah, line managers, nearly 80% don't think their line managers are prepared to explain pay and benefits in line with the directive. So an awful lot of work still to be done.
Gosh, yes, there's a big mountain to climb there. Saul, how have you equipped managers to talk about pay openly?
Yeah, I think on both sides. So line managers really sit at the intersection between our policies and our people. And what we've seen is that pay transparency in essence is really actually a cultural and a change management exercise. Like I said, we have all those foundations in place. So for us, it was key to manage resistors. Obviously, there was a general anxiety that we were seeing across the organization. But we had seen pay transparency rolled out in the US, quite early on, and actually it wasn't that difficult, I think. So it was important for us to address this early on, breaking down some of the myths around pay transparency, and really reinforcing why this is important for our own brand EVP and in increasing employee trust levels.
Thanks. And when you were at ABB, same questions. How did you equip the managers to talk about it? And again, what resistance did you face?
I think just coming back to Saul's point, Saul's organisation has had the foresight to start this process 4 or 5 years ago, and I think that's yielding the returns now. For many organisations, we have a far shorter time period in order to execute this, and therefore it becomes an implementation rather than a strategic focus necessarily. I certainly would say for our line managers, we have of course equipped them with the tools around our pay structures and philosophy, and also to manage individual conversations. When it comes to the pay transparency conversation, come back to what I said earlier. Until we have clarity around some of the legislative processes, it's actually quite difficult to know what we will be precisely saying in any particular country. And look, as for resistance, I think what's intriguing for a number of companies, and ABB is no different, is whether we adopt a global or a regional or indeed a country approach.
Yeah, thank you. Saul, was there a moment where messaging landed badly, even though you had a lot more time to plan this?
Yeah, for us, our communication to all employees actually went out in May 2024 on our internal article. So this was actually one of the highest read articles in recent years, what we had seen at Swiss Re. So for us, it was very, clear on to sort of important to create a clear understanding, address any misconceptions and misunderstandings of what pay transparency meant for Swiss Re. So we interpreted this in how this really responded to Swiss Re's overall ambitions and tied this back to our overall company philosophy and mission statement. So I think by doing that and having a lot of senior stakeholder support at the top to drive this messaging, that really actually landed well for us, and we were able to pick up any inconsistencies quite easily from there.
Interesting. And are there future capabilities that you're investing in? Marion's mentioned that, data and how a lot of companies organize and manage data was one thing that really kind of came out of the report. Is everything, fine at Swiss Re, or is there more kind of ahas that you've got, through this process, which will direct future kind of investment?
Yeah, definitely. Now we're in the second year of paid transparency across all of our EU locations. So moving forward, this is really about future-proofing the organization. So we want to make sure that we have annual refreshing trainings available for line managers, onboarding new line managers to Swiss Re, because we really understand that this knowledge becomes mandatory, and the communication elements around that is obviously it's critical to continue to drive this forward. For us, obviously, we're looking more towards the AI area to invest in the future. So heavily looking at Gen AI and chatbots to support pay transparency and sort of our line managers in driving pay transparency, but also technology around streamlining job evaluations or pay analysis, analytics, but maybe even in the area of regulatory reporting and disclosing. So I think generally, this is really an amazing opportunity for us as reward professionals to create value and impact for our organizations.
Thank you. John, anything you want to add?
I think for us, as I think many of our other members, investment is required on all fronts, whether it be tackling data sources, tools to help talent acquisition, HR business partners, line managers to help make fair pay decisions, external support in terms of understanding the legislation. It is a cost item to execute. And of course, we're in ABB big enough and ugly enough to absorb that. But I worry for a number of mid-sized and smaller companies who will have that burden and not necessarily the resources. I am concerned for them.
Yeah. I think as well, Sarah, I would just add that, as John said, it's a cost, it's a big investment. And, in some of my follow-up calls with our survey respondents, it's not like everything is peaceful inside many organizations. There is already a very high degree of uncertainty, concern, all sorts of, global challenges. And some of our companies as well are themselves going through some sort of quite large business transformation. So one company that I spoke to, they were saying, the hardest thing for us is to get that space on the leadership's agenda. And to help them do that, they had actually created a kind of like a strategic statement, something that was very powerful and clear to explain to their executive committee why pay transparency was so significant and how they did need to have support and to get major stakeholders across the company mobilized.
If we now move the conversation to risks, trade-offs, unintended consequences, obviously transparency isn't without risks. How are you navigating the impact on costs? Has pay transparency had any impact on the hiring strategy, or how you motivate high-performing workers? John, do you want to take this first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sarah. I think the collaboration with talent acquisition is actually critical in this approach. We can't be in a position anymore where folks simply hire based on current earnings plus some kind of nominal increase. And talent acquisition teams that have KPIs based on minimising recruitment costs or minimising, shall we say, starting salary costs are not going to be appropriate anymore in EU countries. So working with talent acquisition on those hiring protocols, tools, KPIs, I think is going to be absolutely critical for this to be successful. So they are certainly some of our best friends in this initiative.
Thank you. Saul, anything to add?
Yeah, I think from a cost perspective, there is the risk that pay transparency may not be cost neutral, either through remediation activities or the legal risks that come with that. So what we're hearing a lot is around compensation compression. This may be an expected outcome for internal and external transparency as more companies come on board. But importantly, it's important that we reinforce that employees can be paid differently as long as it's for objective reasons. There is a sort of a risk around pay normalization. There's a natural gravitation already towards the midpoint. The risk is that we'll to move potentially towards the maximum of the range. So we need to be able to control for this to ensure sort of fair pay decisions and they're free of sort of any biases as well. In terms of our hiring strategy, I would not say a direct impact per se, but important, I think, that would be around the branding element and, as John mentioned as well, around talent attraction. So we're seeing already now a lot of the benefits of pay transparency in us moving as a frontline differentiator in the talent marketplace. But also, how does this become part of our overall EVP and our total reward offering? So it comes back to our market competitiveness, where we try and differentiate further there beyond pay. So we really need to make sure that we're able to build this into our overall recruiting strategies.
Thank you. Marion, anything you'd like to add from your findings in the report?
Yes, I think what's very telling is that in our survey, overall 67% think that net wage bills will increase as a result of the directive, and they're expecting this to be about between a sort of 1 to 2.5%. So definitely this has to be thought about. And I think what Saul said about sort of a levelling effect on pay, or otherwise known as pay compression, nearly 75% of our respondents are concerned about this. So if there is sort of little differential in pay and pay ranges across the organisation, what effect is this going to have on people and on teams? Is it going to be a bit demoralising, a bit demotivating? How are companies going to motivate those really high performers? How are they going to attract workers with very scarce talent that they may need to offer a high wage or set of benefits? So some of those unintended consequences I think are really important, and I think that ultimately we don't want a situation where companies cannot wield pay and benefits as the weapon of talent attraction and engagement as they have wanted, as they want to. So that's a serious question, I think, and I think companies need to be ready for that, because the pay transparency is only 1 year away now.
I think we can reward high performers as long as we have a sound market or objective rationale for what we're going to do. My challenge, I think, for many of us is any of us that have discretionary pay elements, I think they come under real big scrutiny and pressure. So I would predict that in a few years' time, we'll have to adopt a much more formulaic approach to, for example, variable pay with much more objective criteria. And I'll be fascinated to see how some of the financial institutions, for example, you have a high discretionary bonus culture, are going to cope with this new world.
Good point. John, as you lead our Corporate Rewards Council with many organisations on that, what are some of the best practice organisations that you're hearing about that are ensuring that they're not only just complying with the pay transparency, but trying to get ahead and using it as an advantage as employers?
Well, of course, we're talking to one of them, right, Sol? I mean, these are organisations that have done the preparation over the last 4 or 5 years in a layered, structured approach in order to spend time thinking, analysing, and moving forward. And they absolutely have first mover advantage. the vast majority of the rest of our members are now in a dash to simply get compliance.
Saul, you should be incredibly proud, because that sounds like you really are out there on your own. And again, if you were to distill the best practices for others, how would you boil that down? What would you recommend people do?
Yeah, so I think for us, again, we're in a bit of a luxury position, but this was again never a compliance exercise. So from an organizational perspective, we really adopted pay transparency as a global minimum standard and tied that back to our own values and mission statement. So Swiss Re makes the world more resilient. This also equally applies to how our pay and careers are managed within the organization as well. So by sort of effectively building this as a cornerstone of our compensation philosophy and principles, it was easy to leverage that across all of the other human capital lifecycle events. This has really been a differentiator for us, obviously for the business, for our line managers, our employees. And I would also then give the same messaging to our listeners to say really that by integrating transparency into your brand, your culture, your operating activities, allows you to transform it from a trust building asset and further underpin your employee brand as well.
Thank you, Saul. Before we wrap up, I'd like to ask each of you if there's one recommendation that you'd like to give businesses on implementing pay transparency, or anything else that you think that they should be thinking about. What would it be? John, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll steal one from one of the panelists from the conference last week, because it very rarely gets talked about, and that is involvement of your unions and works councils well ahead of implementation of any pay transparency initiative, because they can be either a major impediment to what you're trying to do, or actually a real ally to practically implementing this in the future.
Thank you. Marion?
Yeah, I think, Sarah, I think in a way the message for me is to say to reward teams, you are not alone, and don't try to lead this and do all of this yourself. Yes, you have to do so much of the heavy load, but it's really important to, I think, really build momentum and support and, stakeholder involvement with not just the HR leadership team, but also other vital stakeholders, and not least the executive committee. Really get them on board and help the organisation to mobilise many assets that might be there. Just help the reward team.
Thank you. Saul, anything you'd like to add? I know you've given some excellent points, but anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think if you are going down the compliance route now, at least have that long-term view to really start to, again, sort of build that into your longer-term plan to be able to scale that up to maybe more of a global minimum standard approach. I think, there's an opportunity for us as organizations, HR and reward professionals, to really drive this in the organization. So think long term, and even if you choose compliance for 2026, 27, how can that lead to maybe a global approach years to come?
Thank you. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Let's Talk Global Business. We'll be back next time with a focus on a new topic. Thank you, Marion, John, and Saul, for sharing your insights with us. You can find more content on pay transparency and listen to the entire catalogue of this series programming by visiting our website at conference-board.org. Until next time on Let's Talk Global Business.